Apple CFO steps down, and is Apple really losing at the podcast game? This is MacVoices. Today's edition of MacVoices is brought to you by the MacVoices Dispatch, our weekly newsletter. Visit macvoices.com/newsletter today, sign up, and stay up to date. Welcome to MacVoices. This is the talk of the Apple community, and I'm Chuck Joyner. Folks, we are MacVoices Live on a special night. We shifted the show this week to Wednesday due to my schedule, and then I realized that I have a hard out at 9 o'clock my time, and in other words, for an hour. So we're going to do an hour show, but then we're going to leave the stream open for the rest of the panel to do whatever they do behind my back, and I'll get to see it when I go back to edit. And if you think I'm not terrified, you're not paying attention. So
Chuck,
with that,
there's a very thin line between a brave man and a fool.
Well, I think I'm standing with 1 foot on one side, 1 foot on the other, Jeff, of that line.
I don't know. I think you stepped over.
I wouldn't be a bit surprised. So let's go around, find out who's here. We'll dig in because we have a number of interesting things to talk about tonight, and we'll see how far we get. First up, at where he always is, Mr. David Ginsburg. David, good to see you.
Good to see you as well, Chuck. Glad to be here, and let's have some fun chatting tonight.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. Mr. Eric Bolden is back, this time with a big butterfly. Eric, or is that a moth?
Butterfly.
Butterfly? Okay.
Common buckeye, but it looks colorful, so I thought, why not?
Oh, yeah, it is. It's very colorful. When you say a common buckeye, is that the formal title for it, or you just mean common with a small
common
C?
name is buckeye or common buckeye in this case. I don't know why it's called that. It looks, unusually nice.
Because
we don't call it common at all.
the spots on it look like buckeyes, being here in Ohio.
Ah, okay.
This week in nature. Speaking of this week in nature, we have Mr. Jeff Gamet. Jeff, good to see you.
It was a freak of nature, we might add.
Nice
Web,
transition.
thank you for the clarification, because that was actually necessary. Chuck did leave out that key piece of information.
I was going another place with it, but I thought, no, better not. I've just because I was afraid you might indulge
Do you
me.
want me to stand up?
No.
No.
I mean, I am excited to be here.
Yeah, no, thank you. Thank you.
You got a face palm.
Prove it.
That.
You know.
All right.
Thanks, Webb. That helped a lot. Moving on
This is why I
quickly
love
to
you, Webb.
moving on quickly to Mr. Marty Jencius. Marty, good to have you.
It's good to be here. I'll tell you, every week the doctors whittle another part away from me, and probably by my 100th show, it'll just be my nose. I had another knuckle worked on this week, so little
That's
pieces.
good.
Have you ever seen Boxing Helena?
Oh no, but yeah,
But
I know what
I
you're
think
talking
you probably
about.
should. Yeah. It seems relevant.
Marty, at the risk of running afoul of the medical regulations, are you having multiple knuckles done? I know you said you were having the other hand done, but are you multiple knuckles or or is it a knuckle
Just
at a time?
one knuckle on each hand. They wouldn't do it in the same day, so I had to have one done and then come back 2 weeks later for the other. So
Interesting. Brian Flanigan-Arthurs is here. He's sporting his tie as usual, which means he was coming from work. Brian, thanks so much for making the effort. Good to see you.
Thank you so much. So great to be here.
It's great to have you. Last but absolutely not least, with a different quilt tonight, Mr. Web Bixby. Web, good to have you. And I love the fact that the quilt seems to be going one way, your shirt seems to be going another. I feel like I'm on some kind of drug trip.
Well, I got to admit, I didn't try to coordinate it. It just kind of happened. It's another freak of nature. What can I say? So good to be here, Chuck.
I like it. So the first one I wanted to touch on, because we have a number of interesting ones tonight, it looks like depending on who you listen to and who you read, which is one of the annoying things. Luca Maestri is Apple's CFO, and he is transitioning to a little bit different position in the company after 10 years as CFO, and really doing an amazing job of it. I've always enjoyed his presentations on the earnings call. And so now, and I'm sorry, I'm probably going to get the wrong pronunciation, but I'll try it anyway. Kevan Parekh is his replacement. Now, Kevan has also been on the financial team for quite some time, so it's not like he's an unknown or an untested. But some places are saying this is a shakeup. Some are saying it's a step down toward as Lucas heads toward retirement. I'm kind of curious to see what you all thought, because the first one I saw was retirement. It's like, yeah, okay, that makes probably a certain amount of sense. Then it was a shakeup because of some other things that are happening within the company too. Anybody have a feeling one way or the other?
I'll go first. As a CFO of a public company, one of the things that you're doing 4 times a year is that you are signing to and attesting to the validity of the financial documents that you're presenting. It is a pretty big responsibility. So both Luca signs it and Tim signs it, and they put, in essence, they're putting their reputation on the line. Some could say that's not a big deal, but if there's something that goes on, it's a $3 billion corporation. If there's something goes on downstream, and it comes back, the blood splatter lands right on those two. So it is not unusual for a CFO, especially of a company, especially the size of Apple, that the person who's designated as the chief financial officer might want to step down or just step aside in this case, go do something else within the organization. He still loves Apple as a corporation, and let somebody else take that role. I think that there's a lot of good things that come out of this. So I appreciate Luca. Luca did a lot of great things as far as managing his portion of the company from the financial aspect, and just look at how far they've grown. And how they manage that very effectively. So hats off to him. I'm happy for him. And I think it's Kevan Parekh is how I understood his name. Like I said, he's not a newbie. He's been within the organization for a long time. He probably prepared a lot of the documents that Luca was attesting to. So I think it's all in all a pretty good thing. So, and I am happy for Luca.
Yeah. Because you're right, it's got to be a big responsibility off his shoulders after 10 years.
You look at any 10K that they file, you're going to see a signature on them.
Yeah. Brian?
Yeah, I was just looking at the couple of things. I echo a lot of what Webb had mentioned, but in addition to that, I was just looking at the timing too. It says, that Parekh will take over as CFO on January 1st of 25. So it's nothing that's real immediate. It's not saying that somebody, maybe you would think maybe if somebody got in trouble for something, it would be sooner, right away, I would think. And it's a time that, it's a transitional time. And then also, as it was mentioned before, still having responsibilities elsewhere within the company.
Marty?
Yeah, when I first read this, I thought there's nothing really anything nefarious going on here. For me, here's a guy who's been very successful in a position spearheading the major financial part of Apple. And after 10 years, maybe he just wants a different challenge that kind of stays in his area, but he just wants to get the yoke of being CFO off his back and to try something new in the corporation. I think it's probably out of his own desires to try something new and be in charge of some new area.
In the chat room, Barry says, interesting, signaling succession plans, somewhat of a non-story. Not sure what the controversy would be. And Barry, I'm with you on, except for the non-story part, because if the CFO of the one of the world's most valuable companies steps down, it's going to be news, or steps aside, or transitions, or whatever it is that he's doing. So it's something that everybody's going to take a good hard look at. But other than that, yeah, I echo everything you guys said. Just interesting that we're seeing so much talk about it. Jeff?
I think Webb's perspective on this is totally spot on. So well done, Webb. Go you. I really think that a lot of the coverage of this is trying to stir up a controversy where there isn't one. And my personal feeling, without knowing Luca at all, I've never met him, is that he's done his time and he was ready to move on. And I think that what Apple is doing is a graceful transition to him leaving the company of his own choice. He's not being pushed out. There's no behind the scenes shakeup. He let Tim know that he's ready to call it. So instead of just this fast switchover, they're doing the nice easy transition. Luke is still here. The guy that's been doing a lot of the work behind the scenes for him is taking over. It's all cool, and then in like a year or so, we'll get some low key statement about Luca is off to do whatever he wants now, which is probably, if he's smart, go hang out with his family and relax.
Well said. The next one is a follow-up to something we talked about last week. It's sort of a follow-up, but this comes from Cult of Mac, but it was all over the web, that quote unquote, once dominant Apple Podcasts loses ground to two big competitors. And I think this is another one of those that's interesting to see how it's spun. Because they're saying Apple Podcasts loses market share as YouTube and Spotify overtake it. And I can't quite figure out what this means, because unless I'm wrong, and I think Apple now does have some paid podcasts, but just a very few, but they really have not been in that game at all. Whereas Spotify was throwing ungodly amounts of money at Joe Rogan how many years ago, and has continued to throw ungodly amounts of money at quote unquote celebrities, some of which didn't really pan out very well. Prince Harry and Meghan Markle come to mind. And so, and YouTube, I mean, look, YouTube is, the last I heard, was the world's second largest search engine. So it only makes sense that people are going to put their content on YouTube, just like we do. So I'm trying to figure out if Apple is really losing market share, or if they ever really had it exactly in that way in the first place. Am I making it sense at all?
I have thoughts on this.
Please, Jeff.
All right. I think the initial comparison is wrong because Apple has never been a podcasting platform. They have offered a podcast aggregation tool. So basically an RSS reader for podcasts, whereas Spotify and YouTube are hosting content. And like you said, Apple has just very recently offered some of their own shows. So yeah, this comparison, as I look at this, it doesn't make sense to me, because they're not comparing like things. So saying that Apple has lost their dominant position in the podcast space, this would be a better comparison if they compared Apple Podcasts to the other podcast aggregating apps that you can use, Overcast, Downcast, things like that. That's a fair comparison, or a legit comparison. This comparison doesn't make sense to me.
I'm so glad to hear you say that, because that's the way I felt about it. it's in fact, there was so much criticism for so long about Apple is expending all this effort and bandwidth and everything, and really getting nothing for it. And now all of a sudden, it seems to be like the media is saying, "Oh, Apple's losing out because somebody else is taking these things." Brian, you ask an interesting question.
Yeah, I was just thinking about it. The original definition of a podcast, that I thought it had to be like an RSS feed. I thought, right? So YouTube, they're just, people upload their YouTube videos, and if they upload their, podcast with a still picture the whole time, is that a podcast? Or changing definition of podcast, I guess.
Yes, I'm with you on that. Your definition of podcast is what it has historically been, and saying that shows that are available on Spotify or YouTube as part of their services are podcasts, unless they're also available, like MacVoices is, through an RSS feed, then it's not really a podcast. It's just a online show of some sort.
And sometimes I feel like we may be getting a little too geeky here. We're splitting hairs because, look, let's face it, nobody is listening to podcasts anymore on an iPod. So which is where the whole thing originally came from. So what is it now? Or should we start thinking in terms of webcasts or just online shows or downloadable shows? I don't know. Marty?
Yeah, having just taken two of our podcasts, Vision Profiles and also Circular Firing Squad, and switching them over to YouTube to do live streams with, and then getting the offer to connect your podcast to it. It's basically asking for the source's RSS feed. So the podcasts are stored on other platforms and hosted on other platforms, and they're just pulling it in from the RSS feed. So, where it is doesn't necessarily define it as a podcast. More the fact that it's a subscription service defines it as a podcast versus just media on the web. I'll tell you, I think, the article makes a good argument for the fact that you look at the different groups of people and where they're getting their media. And there's a lot of young males who are getting their podcasts through YouTube. And you have different demographics that are pulling them off of Spotify. And then you have a good percentage of folks that are just using the Apple Podcast app. I agree, and I think Jeff really summed it up well in terms of these are different kinds of platforms. I have to pay for YouTube if I want premium content. I have to pay for around podcasts and anything else. I have to pay for Spotify just to get in the game. But Apple, that podcast app comes with Apple with the products that you have. So it's a different sort of expectation of what these platforms are.
Dave?
Yeah, a couple things. With YouTube, you have, I don't know if you explore this, Chuck, or not, but you have, of course, when I upload my podcast, it goes into on my channel, so you can listen to the show, and then, of course, like Brian said, you have just a picture of your icon. There's no videos to that, but they also incorporate it into YouTube Music. So if you go to YouTube Music, you also have the podcast, but it's more in a music type format. This came from a derivative of Google deciding to get rid of Google Podcasts and discontinuing that, and then move everything over to YouTube. So you had that's what they really did when it comes to adding it to YouTube. But I mean, there's probably some sort of RSS feed, but I think most people are just using our standard RSS feed because they're using a podcatcher. Go to the other side of this. Two notable podcast catchers. So the first one I mentioned was Pocket Cast. and I'm a big fan of Pocket Cast, and I use it all the time. They just added a method to be able to actually rate a podcast. So you know how we always say, go to Apple Podcasts, and then you can rate your podcast there. Well, you can also do it in Pocket Casts too. Now that's pretty new. Then Overcast made a lot of changes to their interface, and I don't think a lot of people were a little unhappy because it seemed to be a little slow and a little sluggish, and not too happy what they did on that side. But there's so many podcatchers out there for being able to absorb all these podcasts that you know, YouTube is a place because there's so many eyeballs on YouTube these days, and I think it was smart that Google did incorporate that and be able to get an audience from there too.
Dave, I think you're right. You and Marty, especially, you know, the idea that we all do video versions, and so then you get a question of, well, is that a podcast or not? If you put out the audio version as a podcast, then at least that is by definition a podcast. But you know, is there such a thing as, or can there be? Yes, I know there can be technically, because I can attach a video file to an RSS feed. But is there a video podcast? Is there such an animal that would be generally viewed? And again, I feel like we're splitting hairs. You know, at the end of the day, Jeff started us out right. I don't get what the big deal is. If Apple's not making any money from it, why would it make a huge difference? Yeah, Eric.
Oh, I guess two things. One, it's not really clear to me from this if the Apple podcast count is separate from if you're watching or listening on Overcast, or if they aggregate the two numbers together. And then it sounded like there's a change recently for whether or not podcasts were automatically downloaded. I can't remember if that was Overcast or Apple Podcasts or both, but it's been changing the count of how many downloads. Now, this is over time, so maybe it doesn't matter, but it's hard to tell if that's influencing some of the numbers changes as well.
Yeah, and I think, in fact, I just saw a notification in my Overcast now that streaming is back. That before, Marco had decided he wasn't going to support streaming, and now I guess he got enough feedback that he brought it back. So,
and that was kind of the game changer for me for Overcast, is the fact you couldn't watch video podcasts if you wanted to in that podcatcher, whereas Pocket Cast you can. Even Downcast, for that matter. I was a user of that app as well. So that's great to hear. That I haven't looked at Overcast lately, and if he's supporting that now, that's great.
David, let me be clear. It says streaming. I didn't read it because I didn't feel like it applied to me. But I don't know if that's video streaming or audio streaming or which. So proceed with caution.
I thought that was audio streaming, because what they were discovering is that a lot of the podcasts are split in two. And if you start streaming right away, then if it had a problem, you could end up getting either part of a repeat or missing a chunk as the second part of it came down, versus waiting for the entire thing to download. Then you knew you had the whole complete podcast.
Okay, I hadn't seen that, so that's interesting. And Marty, you brought up the question of that Apple now has transcripts in their podcast app.
Yeah, that's one of the distinct advantages. I've mentioned this on other shows, the fact that you can get a transcript as an educator. If you have somebody who is in your class that is deaf and cannot hear, you can't really make an assignment of a podcast without having a transcription. And that's done, and really well done, by Apple if you look at the transcriptions.
Okay. I knew you had mentioned that before, but I never thought of you making an assignment of a podcast.
It's an equity issue primarily, but yeah, there are a lot of faculty that are finding good podcasts and assigning them for classes to listen to.
Jeff?
All right. In the chat, Barry's asking about the numbers. Where are the podcast downloads being counted from? Is it from the service, or is it from the RSS feed? All right, so here's how podcast works. The source, like Apple, they're not hosting your files at all. None of these services actually host your files unless it's something like when Chuck uploads the video of today's show to YouTube, then of course that's hosted on YouTube. But for a podcast, you as the podcaster are finding an online server somewhere where you are responsible for hosting. And all of these services, all they're doing is using your RSS feed to point subscribers back to your server, and that's where the download is actually happening from. So Barry, here's where it gets confusing. There's no set way to actually track how many podcasts downloads are happening for any episode ever. So each podcast app, it can give you some sort of information when you are doing your hosting, probably through a podcast host server somewhere. They're giving you numbers based on whatever their algorithms are. And if you are, now we're getting into the inside baseball part. Let's say you are a podcast that has advertising on it. Each of the companies that manages brokering out ads to podcasts has their own way of accounting for download numbers. And so you can have radically different numbers showing up for the same episodes depending on where you look. So it's actually kind of a murky black magic voodoo thing that's happening for tracking all the numbers. The only place you can get actual numbers that would be consistent is if you're looking at the same type of content on the same platform. Where it's actually hosted on that platform. So that would be, you are hosting videos on YouTube. Then you have just YouTube's data to go along with that. And then you could use those numbers and say, well, on YouTube, here's how many views I get. But when you're talking about just regular podcasts, man, it's a crapshoot. It's all over the board, and no one really knows the exact number of downloads and listens they really have.
And Jeff, I'll add to that, and I don't know what the algorithms are, but on YouTube, if a video plays for so long, whether that's measured in seconds or minutes, it's counted as a watch. If a video is played on YouTube, on Facebook, for so many seconds or minutes, it's counted as a watch. But if you don't have that information, which I don't believe is public, or if it is, it keeps changing, then and it's really difficult when you're trying to go to advertisers and say, well, I have this many watches or downloads or views or whatever, because first of all, you're publishing multiple platforms, but worse, you don't know exactly, and everybody I want metrics, and some of them just aren't available.
It's very wishy-washy for the metrics.
Yeah. Dave?
Yeah, just to add on to that before I move on to my other point is, my podcast is hosted on Libsyn. So Libsyn is a podcast hosting service. So they provide me the data as far as unique downloads, IAB downloads, and tells me, how many downloads there are in a week. So there's where you get some of the numbers, but to everybody else's point, it's right. I mean, you don't know because it could be listened from somewhere else, but they're getting it from my RSS feed, which is linked to Libsyn. So I'd have to trust that those numbers are coming from that, because they're counting that every time somebody plays it somewhere, from whether it be a aggregator, because they have to, when you subscribe to the podcast, they have to subscribe to my RSS feed. And even though it's using a podcast aggregator like a podcast, Overcast, or Apple Podcasts, that it's, they're counting that as a download or a listen. So the other point was about Overcast we just talked about. I just went and looked on the site. He has it on here by popular demand that the streaming has returned. It says, so it's non-downloaded episodes will now start to play immediately rather than waiting for the entire episode to download first. So that's his definition of streaming.
Okay. Web?
Very, very related. There's a podcast that I listen to. It's called The Sports Daily by a guy by the name of Reality Steve, who also does a reality TV show podcast as well. But he always mentions at the end of his podcast that you can't just download it, that you got to hit play. Same thing you're saying, but he was saying it in the context of even if you download through the Apple podcast app, that you can't just download it. It considers it as a count or a hit that you got to hit play as well. So I guess there's some sort of tracking bit that they put in to keep track of whether it's been played or not. And like you said, Chuck, whether it's a couple of seconds or a couple of minutes, whatever that threshold is. But that was my only question, is that had you heard that and then the conversation went that way? So that was my technical question. Had anybody heard this? And the answer is yes. So.
Yes. Mm-hmm. So I'm going to move us on so we don't just bore everybody with podcasting, but it's obviously something that's near and dear to pretty much everybody on the panel, even if it's only as a participant on MacVoices Live. Visit MacVoices.com for show notes and to connect with Chuck on social media. Get involved in our Facebook group or like our Facebook page, and get more out of your Apple tech with MacVoices Magazine, free on Flipboard and on the web. And if you find value in it all, consider supporting us through either our Patreon campaign at patreon.com/MacVoices, or by making a one-time donation via the PayPal link on our front page and in the show notes of each episode. You will join these fine people who help bring you MacVoices. Advertising handled by Backbeat Media at backbeatmedia.com. Bandwidth provided by CashFly at cashfly.com.